Today in the studio, I had Henry Goodwin and Shwetank Verma, partners at Leo Capital. In today's episode, we talked about how Singapore is stimulating the early stage ecosystem.
I think what struck me spending time, and in the end it was about 12 years in Singapore, particularly the period between about 2010 and 2020, a real concerted effort from the government over there to stimulate the early stage tech ecosystem.
The India advantage and how talent in India is now global. Loss-making startups can now list on the Indian stock exchange, launching in the Nordics and how smaller markets bring global mindsets, why you have to have the US front of mind if you want to scale, and why becoming an entrepreneur has gone from shame to game on in India and the diaspora.
So there's a Startup India mission, so you being an entrepreneur started being rather than what you did when you couldn't
do
hired.
anything else, yeah. Let's get straight into it. This is Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah, the podcast where I talk to the people behind the stories that make the venture capital ecosystem go round. I've been working with startups from pre-seed to Series C for the last decade, and companies that I've worked with have gone on to realize value and exit, or raise funds in excess of $500 million. I really hope you enjoy the episode, and if you have a guest that you'd love to see me have on, or you have a comment on any of the episodes that I've recorded so far, do reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get straight into it. Henry, Shwetank, really great to have you in the studio with me.
Thank you, Aarish. Great to be here.
Amazing.
Thanks, Aarish.
Let's get straight into it. So this podcast has been quite Western-centric, I think, many of our guests having come from the US, UK, or European ecosystem. So it's quite exciting to have you on, as I'd love to understand a bit more about the environment in South and Southeast Asia. Henry, you work closely with the Singaporean government on porting tax-friendly structures like the UK SEIS and EIS schemes there. How would you describe the ecosystem out in Singapore and beyond? And what are the key differentiators between it and, say, the European venture market?
Sure, Aarish. So I think what struck me spending time, and in the end it was about 12 years in Singapore, particularly the period between about 2010 and 2020, a real concerted effort from the government over there to stimulate the early stage tech ecosystem. So if you're looking at the kind of top-down incentives, government-led incentives, the early stage venture fund program that they launched at the seed and Series A and ultimately sort of corporate end of the spectrum as well, I think was a very well organized and executed attempt to introduce capital into the system, very simply put, and to accept as well that there would be a high degree of write-off, understandably, in doing that, but it was a necessary step in order to stimulate the ecosystem. Singapore's already a very sort of tax-friendly environment, of course, but still, as Singapore has always been expert at doing, was very good at looking at best practice from around the world. So the piece around, I guess, the UK side of things was, and I could not at all claim to be an architect of this, but was involved very much on the fringes, but looking at how might the lessons learned from the UK EIS, SEIS regimes, translate into Singapore, mainly on the income tax side, as CGT isn't there in the same way. So I think Singapore has always been able to reinvent itself and to find new ways of plugging gaps in terms of incentives. The same goes for the regulation, actually. So data protection regulation, cyber, and now, of course, AI is prevalent as well. UK's got a very strong relationship and trading partnership with Singapore through the DEA and other trade agreements. So I think that was very evident in the early part of the last decade. Then in terms of the sort of ground up entrepreneurial talent is very much in evidence there. There's a very strong STEM tradition. So bringing those together was an important part of the story, I think, for that period of time. And I think it's lucky, Shwetank and I were there to witness that, and it was a very powerful lesson in how things can change over a period of time. It's obviously a long journey to go still for Singapore, and I think there's a lot of speculation out there about the recycling of talent and capital, finding the right exits to allow that to happen. So there's an obvious contrast, I guess, with Europe as well, where that cycle has repeated itself already. To the extent that the next generation coming through can benefit from that, perhaps in a slightly different way. But I think it was a great eye opener and great thing to have seen during that period, and something that we certainly draw on, frequently when we're looking here at the opportunities in Europe as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because Singapore, I think, was one of the forerunners around crypto regulation and how they dealt with, Web3, I guess, back in, the late 2019s, late teens, early 20s. But equally, I recently saw a video clip of the Singaporean Parliament where they've introduced or are introducing legislation or have proposed legislation whereby they are going to subsidize the reskilling and upskilling of kind of, I guess, middle-aged, so 40, 50-year-old people in Singapore to preempt kind of the rise of AI within within the ecosystem and how disruptive that might be, I guess, to people's lives and jobs, which I think is really forward thinking. And I think when I think about Singapore, having spent a bit of time there myself, it's always struck me as being a country and a city that has reinvented it, to your point, has reinvented itself, but has always reinvented itself at the forefront, right? So it's a bit like Dubai, whereas Dubai went, I think, down a very commercial route. Singapore has always been, very, very much part of that sort of global capital markets kind of philosophy, very strong ties with Hong Kong, obviously, within Southeast Asia as a whole, a great hub, both for talent as well as for travel, as well as for capital. So it feels like it's the sort of place where, things are happening or will happen. And I think there are definitely lessons to be learned over here about how progressive and proactive they are about treating some of this stuff. And I know that obviously the Singapore government works in a slightly different way to the UK. Politicians are certainly paid a bit more, I guess.
It does make me laugh when you hear politicians here talk about we can be the next Singapore.
Yeah.
It might take a while, but...
Well, I mean, most of them are saying we could be the next Silicon Valley. I'm like, look, first, fix what you've done to the R&D system, fix like all the other problems that you've almost self-created, and then let's talk about where we go from there. But yeah, it sounds like it was a really interesting sort of environment, I guess, to have been in at that time. And Shwetank, you obviously founded and exited a business in India, whilst one of your co-founders, Rajul Garg, also had significant exits from the businesses that he founded there. So talk us through what you call the India advantage and how that informed your decision to launch Leo back in 2018.
Yeah, great question, Aarish. So the India advantage to us is just the talent piece. It is the fact that there are 1.4 billion Indians in India, and 500 million people of Indian origin outside.
And a lot of them running like the biggest tech companies in the world, yeah.
Biggest tech companies, biggest governments, biggest think tanks, whatever you want to call it. And if you look historically at sort of how India has generated alpha, it has always been through its people. So that, to us, that was the jumping off point of the India advantage. We thought about it, that how do you generate alpha from India? So there are two options on that, really. You can go deep into the Indian domestic consumption story, which of course a lot of VCs are doing, and there's a massive demand growth and consumption growth that's coming, and that's happening already. But we thought that the more interesting option or less explored option is how do you think about India powering the globe? That the Indian talent piece, which is actually the most sort of influential diaspora in the world, how are they going around the world and creating businesses, opportunities, sort of things globally. So that's what we decided to sort of really focus in on, that we will invest in the Indian diaspora globally. That was the jumping off point in 2018. Now we see that there's many more opportunities of the India advantage. You don't need to invest just in the Indian diaspora. The capabilities of Indian engineers, of Indian talent is well known. You can actually invest in the best founders globally and power them with the access to the Indian talent. And the way I think about it is almost like the Intel Insight piece, right? So it is the processing power that you can add to a team, helping them to sort of scale the next level, cheaper, faster, better. That's the Indian advantage. That's what we're trying to bring now globally from the India side.
So just to kind of, I guess, maybe challenge that, and look, I mean, I'm well aware of the talent piece. I mean, in my time in New Guinea and Australia, we would certainly hire in from India. Because the talent, compared to certainly in those days, the sort of salary points was far more economical, and indeed in the businesses that we have or that my family has had in Africa, a lot of the talent comes again from India, but India is becoming more expensive, and I think secondly. there is this sort of problem around offshoring, and people are looking to nearshore and onshore more to create more security around and defensibility around both the products as well as the businesses they're building. So how do you think India will be able to cope with that? Because there was obviously a massive, back in the 80s, 90s, there was a massive piece of offshoring. You had, finance teams, you had call centers, you had back office functions all being sort of offshore to India. A lot of those have now come back onshore. The tech piece is interesting because you obviously have these hubs like Bangalore, and now I guess throughout India, where you have really exceptional talent and talent coming out of places like IIT, IIM. But with that, as the middle class has grown and as the middle class are becoming more interested in having a Western, I guess, level of lifestyle, do you think that is going to become a challenge with this sort of India advantage question?
So I think you have to think about India advantage as much more than just cost.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only thinking of cost arbitrage, it may or may not work out.
Mm-hmm.
It is still remains one of the few places where you can build. I guess maybe you're taking a step back. If I think of, if you're going to be a venture scale team,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have some part of your team, some level of Indian people in your team. You look at any unicorn today,
Yeah.
Revolut, Miro, all of them have teams. You look at the large companies, JP Morgan, Meta, Microsoft, have massive centers, right? 30,000, 90,000 people in India. So it's a function of scale,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that certain critical mass of people are more easily available
It's
in
talent
India.
density, I guess, right?
Exactly, that's what I meant by is more easily available in India. Cost remains actually still a lot cheaper all in, because things like health insurance, office, and all of that are still a fraction of what they are in, say, central London, San Francisco, etc. But yeah, I mean, if you look at maybe just pure cost of the salary, that is converging. But again, I don't think of it as just as a cost arbitrage piece. If you are a world-class talent, you should be paid what you can get anywhere in the world. So I don't particularly push the cost side.
Yeah, sadly, that was the CFO question. had to come out. But no, look, I completely take your point. And I think, yeah, you've got to look at it as the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. I guess also some of the thought processes, among some of these industries, I've been fortunate enough to have worked with businesses that, have certainly had elements of team members out there, and, equally with sort of tech partners, with teams out in India. And one of them, I remember, they've built, fintech, crypto, blockchain, all sorts of actually core systems within those technologies that were only being sort of thought about, I guess, in the UK or maybe in the US beforehand. And yes, to your point, obviously, if you look at all-in costs, if you look at, the not just the salary cost, but as you say, whether it's healthcare, whether it's accommodation, office space, etc., you still end up better off. And equally, I think the other thing, and this is one of the things that I realized when I was in Papua New Guinea, we forget that most Indians don't live in the city centers, and a lot of them are more than happy to travel. And share accommodation, live together, live communally, with no negative kind of connotations to that at all. And that sense of, I guess, camaraderie and community is one of the things that actually is, again, to your point, one of the advantages. But on a related point, I'd love to understand how talent and capital are recycled in the Indian ecosystem and how far progressed we are there, right? And on a kind of related point, having spoken to other VCs and investors in India in the past, one of the issues would seem to be how to get liquidity on the subcontinent, right? So what is your view on that? And how do you think that has changed and is likely to change in the future?
Yeah, that's changed rapidly over the last 5 years, for sure, Aarish. So the one big thing that has happened is that there are a lot more people now who know what scale and good looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So you've had not only the first generation of scalers like the Flipkarts, you've had the second generation, the Mishos, the Olas, etc. So the critical mass of people who know what scale and what good looks like at scale has grown exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then COVID actually in that sense was quite helpful. It allowed not just engineering, but other functions like inside sales, marketing, to also become global in their approach. So rather than focused on India, they started getting remote jobs. Everyone started upskilling to global levels rather than local levels. And that has now created exceptional people across functions. So from engineering, it's gone across functions. And the joy of all of this is that as a startup, you can now bring on people who have done the specific thing you're looking to do. Say you're looking to sell testing automation software. The people who have sold testing automation software, remotely for the last 3 years, last 5 years, so they can really hit the ground running and bring instant benefits to you as a founder, vis-a-vis earlier where you had to have a bit of a ramp up time and all of that. So that's the exciting part of the people circling and excellence sort of becoming more of the norm rather than the exception in the local ecosystem. On the exits and on the liquidity side as well, some very positive things have happened. So the biggest positive is that the local stock market has started accepting loss-making companies to list. So this was a big change that's only happened in 2018. Till then, you had to have 3 years of profitability before you could list, which is, of course, mostly unheard of in tech startups. But that changed, and a bunch of companies have gone public and been well received by the local stock market. So that is the key part, right? So you actually get better multiples in India now than you do on the NASDAQ, much better than you get on the LSE.
Let us not go into that. I mean, this is a pain point for almost everyone that we get on the podcast.
Yeah. So companies like Zomato, Paytm, Nykaa have all gone public. Share prices have held up, and the local investors, the local institutions specifically, have understood that the initial loss making is okay if you see a path to a significant profit stream down the line.
Yeah.
So that has allowed a lot more companies to go public, and that has had two impacts. Obviously, there's the public liquidity, but equally, it has forced the existing large companies to actually do M&A and pay real money, because now there's an option. If you earlier there was no option. If you're a loss-making company, you had to sell, you had to take whatever price you were getting. Now there's an option. If I don't like the price, I can try and go public, see what happens.
Take my chances. Yeah.
And so the value of the M&A has risen as well, creating this 1-2 punch for liquidity, which is going to play out, I think, quite substantially over the next decade as more and more of these companies that were. I mean, look, the Indian ecosystem is still, tech ecosystem is still fairly nascent, right? I mean, really, it started with, I'd say, sort of 2014 when Jio and mobile phone penetration really took off. So it's 10 years old, effectively. In the next 10 years, this question will be moot because you will see a lot more exits and recycling of cash coming from these two things that have happened.
What's really interesting, just as you're talking, so again, as I said, this question about the LSE and Europe in general, actually, in terms of liquidity, IPOs, exits, is a big problem. It sounds like India has actually leapfrogged where UK and Europe are on as far as that is concerned, because one of the big problems, again, and why so many businesses in Europe look to the US is, A, there are no strategic buyers here in Europe generally, as in there are fewer of them. There just aren't that many companies with that bigger scale. And secondly, to your point, that optionality isn't here because you can't list in the UK or in Europe and have those multiples stand up. There just isn't appetite in the public markets. We had Dan Bowyer and Mads Jensen from Superseed on recently, and we talked about, there was an article about creating a European NASDAQ. And the point is, you could create the infrastructure, but the point is, if the appetite and that risk aversion isn't removed from the mentality and the mindset in the public markets, then still your best option is to go to the US. And in India, rather than now, it sounds like having to make that jump to the US, you can actually create wealth.
A lot of people are sort of flipping back and listing on India. So if you're a domestic consumption-led business, you're getting great multiples in India.
Yeah. Wow. Unsurprising. Yeah.
But if you're a global SaaS business, basically if your revenue stream is more US, it's still better to list in the US. But if your revenue stream is more India or emerging markets, it just makes much more sense now to list in India vis-a-vis another market. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And Henry, Leo is now launching in the Europe and Nordics, specifically Finland, in late 2023. This is a long way from either India or Singapore. So talk me through the rationale behind that expansion and what Leo brings to the table from the experience in Asia.
Sure. So clearly, when we're looking at the B2B SaaS area, which is our core focus, it is a global marketplace. It's a global marketplace for talent. talent is evenly distributed geographically and chronologically. There's always great people coming through. They've had a rough time of it in the last couple of years, but there's always great people coming through. And there are always opportunities for those people to then gain access to the key markets. As we've just discussed, the US, is still the most valuable market, and that's an important part of our playbook. We've spoken about the talent angle with the India advantage, but also about finding their way into the US market in terms of go-to-market and also in terms of follow-on funding as well. So that remains the case. We want to try and help people along that journey. So having said that, we see, although you're right, it's a long way from India and Singapore, there is something about the global mindset that you see in some of these smaller countries in the Nordics that is a function of the size of the local market. That we see as being an interesting parallel with Singapore. Of course, it's very different. If you're talking about Estonia, Sweden, Finland, these markets, in amongst themselves are extremely different. We've learned pretty quickly about the different countries and how they view each other. There's some healthy competition up there. But what is absolutely certain is there's a really strong talent base, a very strong STEM tradition, a supportive and enabling government. Some of this may echo some of what I was saying earlier.
Yeah, for sure.
And as I say, this global mindset. So for us, a huge opportunity really to play a part in those ecosystems in our own way, to bring some of what we've learned in helping the best entrepreneurs to scale out of Asia and look towards the US. There's a well-trodden path between Asia and the US, but that is yet to be replicated in quite the same way between Europe and the US as well. So if you imagine us being able to help people think about some of the talent challenges, as we've discussed, number one, and then to help them find ways of getting access to the US market, number two, we think there's some great opportunities for us to play an important role in that part of the world as well.
Yeah.
If I may just add
no,
briefly on that, Aarish. So a great startup is three things: phenomenal founders, A+ team, great markets.
Mm-hmm.
We can't bring the first. You have to be a phenomenal founder.
Yeah.
We can bring the other two, and that's what we're trying to bring to the European market. So A+ team, that's the India advantage of the talent side that you spoke about.
Yeah.
And great markets. The US remains one of the greatest markets to sell into. So how do you do that as an international founder? We've built playbooks for that over the last decade or so, even longer actually, if I think about it. And just bringing that in a easy to implement manner to the founders in Europe. So we are searching for the exceptional founders and hoping to add these two elements to their journey and make it work.
Yeah, look, it makes a lot of sense. Again, we've had Enes Huli on from 500 Emerging Europe, so part of the 500 Startups, 500 Global family. And, in Turkey and Eastern Europe, which is where, he plays, as it were, exactly the same point in the sense that the founders that they're looking, well, slightly differently made, I guess. The founders that they're looking for, or that he is looking for, are ones that already have that US mindset and are already working in US markets, because they know that in Eastern Europe, they're not going to be able to achieve global scale, right? So as in the markets are too small, too fragmented, et cetera, but the talent is good. And if they have an eye on the US, that's great, but actually they need to be sort of US first almost. Occasionally, maybe UK or Germany, Western Europe, fine. But ultimately the US. And I guess this is the thing, right? We've talked about this quite a fair few times on the podcast. You talked about India, the tech ecosystem really only having kind of kicked off from 2014. We talked about on this podcast in the past, UK, 15 years ago had 3 billion of VC capital going into startups. Today it has about 30 billion. The US, has been going since the 50s and 60s, right? Like that is where the VC kind of ethos and ecosystem built from. So they are decades ahead. It makes sense that they are that much further ahead in terms of how they think, in terms of their appetite, in terms of the number of operators that are VCs versus sort of purely finance kind of focused VCs. It therefore is no surprise, I guess, that market still remains so important globally. I mean, I think, most of us would understand why in the UK, Europe, you'd want to hop across the pond. It makes sense. There's a lot of synergies. I guess in the Southeast Asian markets, especially, there isn't that natural link, I guess, back to the US, other than, as you said, now there's lots of talent that are working remotely with US companies and so on. But otherwise, there is no big market. I mean, the big markets are what? China, Australia maybe, but not even really from that perspective. So if you're not looking at the US, where do you go, I guess, right? And to your point, yes, consumer in India works because why? You got 1.4 billion people there spending money, growing middle class, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, for B2B SaaS, locally there isn't
enough. Yeah. I mean, basically, if you're a B2B company, unless you can sell into China, you have to go to the US at the moment.
Yeah.
Because the ceiling for revenue in India is say $15-20 million. In Europe, you can get to say 50-60. But if you want to get to that 500 million and above, you still have to sell to the US. That may change over sort of the next 20 years as the Indian businesses become wealthier, pay more.
Because everything changes.
Yes, everything changes. And India will become a very important market over time, but it's not there yet. In 20 years, perhaps, of at least 10 years. But till then, you have to have, as a B2B founder, you have to have an eye on the US. And that's the only real way to build a venture scale business.
So just touching on a point there, I'd love to get your view because I haven't really thought about China. I mean, I think about China in terms of its tech dominance in various fields. I mean, again, we only know what we know or what, the Chinese government puts out. But I mean, is it natural or normal for companies in either India, Singapore, and Southeast Asia more generally? Is it normal for them to enter the Chinese market, or is that typically happen via an acquisition by a larger Chinese company and bringing them in? I mean,
yeah, it's not natural. I mean, the Chinese ecosystem is a bit more closed.
Yeah,
and the Japanese. I mean, so if I think about SaaS, so China and Japan both have significant SaaS spends in the internal markets, but it's really hard to access from an outside perspective. So that's where the US is fairly unique in the sense they're pretty open to accessing if they like the solution. Doesn't really matter where the company's from. It's not that.
But therein lies the challenge, because to convince founders to start to build that into their roadmap and their thinking from an earlier stage is the challenge. Because of course, you know what you know, and there's 750 million people in Europe. There's almost 700 million people in Southeast Asia. There's lots of exciting things to think about what might be available to you in the regional markets. But to do the mind flip of thinking, well, how do we think about US at what stage? And trying to get people to build that thinking in much earlier is a big part of the solution.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say and add to that. I mean, I think the way I always think about it is, whilst the US is 50 states under one federation, right? So it's almost like 50 different countries. You still don't have the complexities of localization. You don't have the complexities at the federal level, like all the taxes, et cetera, kind of work the same. Yes, you got to deal with then state kind of problems, but you don't have the problem that you would have in Europe, where you localize in France, it's got to be in French. You localize in Germany, it's got to be in Germany. You've got to deal with the tax laws in Germany versus the tax laws in France versus tax laws in UK, which is why again we're seeing sort of alternatives for zero cropping up in the accounting package cropping up in France. You have Penny Lane. In Germany you have others, etc., etc. And I guess in Asia in general, that's probably just as bad, if not worse, because again, you have, there isn't even, at least in Europe, you have the EU, which somewhat umbrellas everything together. But in Southeast Asia, each and every state is acting autonomously, right?
Yep, it is. And the depth of spend in each market on the business side is also pretty low. So I think the key is just this, that how do you convince people to think about the US from day one? Because founders naturally feel like, let me build 5-10 million euros of revenue in Europe before but it's counterproductive almost, because you will live or die on venture scale. You will live or die if you succeed in the US.
Yeah.
And so if you succeed in the US, your 10 million here is not meaningful.
Yeah.
If you don't succeed, it's still not meaningful.
So we had someone on the podcast, I can't remember now who it was, who said, you can always go down the pyramid. It's really hard to go up, right?
Yep.
So if you build a 10 million, $20 million business here in the UK, doesn't naturally mean that you go to the US and you can replicate a playbook that then scales. It's actually better and easier to go tackle that bigger market, get it right there, and then go into the smaller markets thereafter. Right?
Yeah, I fully agree with that, because by the time you build a 20 million pound business here, a lot of, the companies used to certain rhythms, ways of working, etc. And it's just then much harder to figure out how to make that work.
Yeah.
So,
And someone in the US is probably going to raise double the funding and launch in any case.
Double if you're lucky, triple.
This is always the way. I guess, I mean, look, one final question maybe to kind of round this all off. I mean, Henry, obviously you talked about kind of how bullish you guys are on Europe, the Nordics, etc. Where do you think the gaps are? I mean, you know, there are very clear opportunities for sure. Talked about some of the gaps around kind of that later stage capital in Europe, but also, you know, the markets and ability to sort of transact in the US being so important in order to create that scale. But what are the other complexities or challenges that you think either in the Nordics or in Europe more widely that need to be fixed to be able to take things forward as well?
Well, I think at a very basic level, it's just getting money deployed in the market. I think we're coming out of a pretty weird period where it's been really tough for everyone, in fact, all the way from the LPs to the GPs and through to the founders. Getting that liquidity back in the market, we can play a part in doing that. And I think, certainly you wouldn't be in this game if you weren't optimistic by nature. So we believe that there's a good time. We're coming into a great vintage now. And it's a really good time to be helping the next generation. They've done nothing wrong. They deserve capital as much as anyone else. So we can help them do that. And I think as we've alluded to, you know, bring something a slightly different perspective, perhaps in some ways. There's some extremely good funds operating in the Nordics, of course, and across Europe already. There's a lot of people in B2B SaaS, but we feel hopefully that we bring something a little bit different, as we've mentioned, in terms of the playbook and what we've seen, particularly looking at Asia, looking at the Indian talent piece as well, and the increasing influence that's having on the global tech scene. So I think a little bit of that knowledge and awareness and the power of that engine from the talent side. And then, as we said, sort of looking towards and just, it's a kind of mindset shift. It's borrowing a bit of the Singapore global mindset, if you like, and sort of encouraging people that way. It's somewhat self-selecting. The great founders keep an open mind and are always happy to listen and find new ideas and don't think they've figured it all out. Yep. We certainly haven't either. But it's that kind of meeting of minds, I think, when you can see that great talented founder and they're open to looking at their roadmap, looking at the US in that particular light, and also recognizing that if you're going to build $1 billion company, there are going to be some gaps in your team sheet, and you're going to need to fill them in a capital efficient way. Yep. And we've got an answer for that as well. Yeah, amazing. Shwetank, actually, I have one last question for you. It's a bit of a cheeky one, so do excuse me. Obviously, as you said, during the quickfire round, you were an accountant, a chartered accountant. As am I, chartered management accountant. One of the biggest challenges I see for Indian diaspora founders is that it isn't looked on in the wider community as a sensible or viable route to creating wealth, right? Like, I mean, I certainly was always conditioned, lawyer, doctor, well, actually wasn't even lawyer, doctor. It was potentially lawyer, but it certainly wasn't doctor, but, lawyer, accountant, kind of those are the roots, business, but not creating a business, maybe running a business or managing a business, right? But basically getting on the employee treadmill, and that's how you show success. And certainly, I know from my own personal experience, my parents still struggle to kind of explain what I do. And I think they still aren't entirely sure and aren't, I think they're proud now, but, I don't think for a while they really kind of understood what what that entrepreneurial journey maybe look like. So yeah, what advice would you get? Maybe not to the founders, but to their parents and their uncles and aunts.
It's a great point, Aarish. I mean, I same journey, right? And that's why I guess we're all chartered accountants. I
was a linguist first, so you can imagine how well that went down. But yeah,
path to the life is a solid job that you can keep going back to. Just one color piece to add. So this was the case in India as well, which has really changed over the last 5-6 years because the government made a huge push there. So there's a Startup India mission. So you being an entrepreneur started being, rather than what you did when you couldn't hired,
do anything else,
to being a first choice. And you've seen the change in IITs and all of that, where earlier they would, the biggest thing would be being hired by McKinsey. It's actually now starting your own company. So, or McKinsey, Google, whatever, right? So that's been a big change, and it's twofold, right? The government made a push to destigmatize entrepreneurship, and then people saw real wealth being created, right? I think, and again, in the US, people have seen that. So again, the Indian diaspora in the US does not suffer from this.
Yes.
So over here, I don't think we're going to get any government support, but we need to see real wealth created, right? And I think that then creates its own flywheel of saying, okay, this is acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, one would hope that with Rishi sort of sitting in number 10, there is something to aspire to, but, it's difficult. It really, I think, and it's not just, I think the Indian community, I think a lot of Southeast Asian communities have similar quote unquote problems, but hopefully we'll get out there. We have some of the biggest companies in the world are being run by, people from the Indian diaspora. And
that's still a good job.
it's still a job. It is still a good job. It is a job. But, but equally, I think there are a lot of, a lot of people from the diaspora now, going out launching really generational businesses.
There are generational businesses being built, from sort of Zscaler to, Jyoti's businesses, etc. So yeah, a lot of people have built now, again, in the US, no shortage of phenomenal Indian origin founders and Indian founders.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot to look forward to.
Amazing. Henry, Shwetank, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the podcast with me today. For our listeners, where is the best place for them to find you online? Are you on LinkedIn, Twitter? Where can they find you?
Yep, we're on LinkedIn, we're on the socials, and VO.capital, the website as well. So keep an eye out for us. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, very happy to receive cold outreach. We don't need warm intros. We respond to every email that we receive.
Okay, you're doing better than I am in that case. But thank you so much, guys, for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks,
Thanks, Aarish. Really appreciate it.
it.